That DNA test is wrong. The words rang out from the back of the glass chapel, just as Reverend Thomas Hale turned toward Nathaniel Whitmore. Please stop the vows, sir. For one frozen moment, no one moved. From her place beside the altar, Victoria Langford stepped forward. Her voice sharpened as she fought to maintain control. What nonsense are you talking about, you worthless maid? Get her out of here. Where is security? Nate stood motionless. He had faced hostile board meetings, federal investigations, and corporate rivals who had spent years trying to remove him from his own company. None of those battles had prepared him for the sight of a young maid standing alone in the center aisle of his wedding chapel. What the hell did you just say? He demanded, staring at Annie Carter. Who gave you the nerve to do this? The bride bribed your assistant, Annie said, forcing steadiness into her voice. They are working together to deceive you. Please believe me. Nate frowned. You just started working here, aren't you? Yes, sir. I came to fill in for my mother, but that isn't important. You need to know that. Victoria's complexion had gone pale. She cut Annie off before the girl could finish. I'm sorry, everyone, Victoria said gently to the guests. She is under a great deal of pressure. Her mother is seriously ill. Every face in the chapel had turned toward her. No, Annie insisted. You have to listen to me. The test result is fake. Your assistant betrayed you. And a wave of whispers spread through the chapel. What does that maid think she's doing? How could she invent something so terrible? But what if she's telling the truth? I heard Victoria was pregnant and pushed Mr. Whitmore to move the wedding up as quickly as possible. Nate did not take his eyes off Annie. To his right stood Calvin Ross, the executive assistant who had served him for more than 20 years. Calvin held a leather briefcase containing the papers Nate and Victoria were scheduled to sign after the ceremony. His fingers were tightening around the handle. Julian Whitmore sat in the first family row beside his mother. Nate's younger brother was not looking at Annie. He was looking at Victoria. That was what caught Nate's attention. He noticed the look exchanged between his brother and his bride. Reverend Hale cleared his throat. Mr. Whitmore, perhaps we should pause for a moment. No, Victoria said before Nate could answer. She turned toward him, tears already gathering in her eyes. We should not allow an unstable employee to humiliate us in front of everyone we love. Annie stepped forward. Mr. Whitmore, you have to believe me. Victoria's restraint broke. What do you mean, the test is fake? She shouted. Then she turned toward Julian. Julian, protect me. Don't let this filthy servant destroy my reputation. She searched the room for the security officers. What are you being paid for, standing there and watching? Throw this miserable girl out. 2 security guards immediately moved from the side entrance. Stay where you are, one of them ordered. Annie stopped. There was none of the practiced confidence of a skilled liar in her face. She looked frightened enough to run, but determined enough to remain where she stood. Mr. Whitmore, she said, please don't sign anything. Victoria gave a short, injured laugh. Anything? Do you even understand what you are accusing us of? Annie looked toward Calvin. I understand that someone was paid to give him a false report. Calvin stepped forward. Nathaniel, this is absurd. Miss Carter has only worked here for 3 days. She has no access to private records. The fact that Calvin knew Annie's name caught Nate's attention. He had never introduced them. How do you know her name? Calvin hesitated. Sir, I reviewed the temporary staff list. That is perfectly normal. I pay attention to everything around you. It was a reasonable explanation. Still, something about how quickly Calvin had responded unsettled Nate. Julian rose from his seat and buttoned his jacket. That is enough. Get her out before every camera in Charleston turns this into a circus. Several guests glanced toward the chapel entrance, where phones had already begun to rise. Margaret Whitmore remained seated with her back straight. At 76, she did not need to raise her voice to command a room. Annie, your mother has served this family with dignity for 12 years. Do not repay her by turning yourself into a public embarrassment. The words hurt more than shouting would have. Annie tightened her hand around the handkerchief inside her pocket. She remembered her mother lying in a hospital bed that morning, exhausted after dialysis. She could leave. The side door was only a few steps away. She could apologize, lower her head, and tell herself she had tried. Then she saw Calvin lean toward Nate. The study is locked, he whispered. Whatever she claims is inside can wait. Annie lifted her head. I never said anything was in the study. Calvin went still. The entire chapel seemed to close in around him. Nate slowly turned. Why did you mention my study? Calvin's expression shifted just enough for Nate to see the effort behind it. Because she told you not to sign anything. Your documents are kept in the study. It was a reasonable assumption. Then let your attorney decide whether it was reasonable, Annie said. Victoria turned fully toward her. The softness had disappeared from her eyes. You walk into this house wearing your mother's uniform. Accept help from this family. And choose our wedding day to accuse us of fraud. What exactly do you want? Money? Attention? A scholarship? Several guests nodded. Annie felt their eyes moving over her dark skin. Some of them had already decided what kind of girl she was. To them, wealth was evidence. She swallowed. I'm not asking him to believe me just because I'm standing here, she said. I'm only asking him to wait long enough to find out whether I'm lying. One of the security officers reached for her arm. Annie looked directly at Nate. The most loyal person is not always the one standing closest to us. Sometimes it is the only person brave enough to step forward when everyone else chooses silence. Nate looked at Calvin, the man who had managed his life for 20 years. He looked at Julian, the younger brother he had rescued from more mistakes than either of them could count. Then he looked at Victoria, whose hand still rested over the future Nate had wanted badly enough to trust without question. Finally, he looked at Annie. Take your hand off her, he told security. Victoria stared at him. Not. He turned toward Reverend Hale. Stop the wedding. Stop the wedding? Are you out of your mind, Nate? Victoria's scream tore through the glass chapel. She rushed forward, her long veil dragging across the stone floor. The fear that had drained the color from her face twisted into anger. You would humiliate me in front of our families and every guest here because some bored little maid invented a story? She turned on Annie. You miserable bitch. Do you have any idea what your filthy accusation will cost you? I will make you regret this. That's enough. Nate stepped between them. His voice remained controlled, but the room heard the warning in it. He looked at Annie. That is your name, correct? Yes, sir. Then give me a reason not to have you removed. You walked into my wedding and accused 3 people of fraud. You had better know exactly what you are saying. Annie held his gaze. Sir, I would never betray someone who helped my mother, but I'm not foolish enough to stand here and let these people insult me unless I know what I heard. Victoria lunged forward. You, Nate raised one hand. Victoria, stop. You're pregnant. If Annie has lied, she will answer for it. She has already destroyed our wedding, Victoria cried. She stood in front of everyone and claimed I'm not carrying your child. What do you think people will say now, Nate? Nate did not look at her. His attention had settled on Calvin Ross. The older assistant had moved back half a step without seeming to notice. His shoulders were almost against the edge of the raised platform. The leather briefcase remained locked beneath both hands. Calvin, Nate said, his voice dropping. Explain something to me. Annie never mentioned my study, yet you brought it up before I had time to ask a single question. Sweat had appeared across Calvin's forehead. He swallowed and forced his features into the composed expression Nate had seen through 2 decades of negotiations, funerals, and financial crises. Mr. Whitmore, please remain calm. I have managed your schedule and private records for 20 years. When an outsider suddenly accuses someone of financial fraud, it is natural for me to think of the room where your most important documents are kept. It was a logical conclusion, nothing more. Margaret Whitmore slowly rose from the front row. The pearl brooch on her jacket moved with her uneven breathing. She looked at Annie with the stern disappointment of a woman who believed gratitude should have a proper posture. Annie, this family gave you an opportunity. We helped your mother when she was lying on an operating table. Is this how the Carter family repays kindness? By turning a private wedding into public entertainment? Annie tightened her fingers around the blue handkerchief in her pocket. Her heart struck hard against her ribs. For a moment, she could feel nothing else. Then she raised her head. Mrs. Whitmore, my mother taught me to be grateful to anyone who helps our family. But gratitude does not mean lowering my head and staying silent while people carry out a fraud. If I were making this up, why is everyone so desperate to throw me out before I can finish speaking? If you admire Annie's courage and believe she deserves the chance to tell the truth, please give this video a like. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from, because someone near you may be watching this story with you right now. Now, let's return to Annie and see whether she can prove what really happened. How dare you? Victoria charged toward her, one hand lifted, her nails aimed at Annie's face. Stop her, Nate ordered. The two security officers moved at once. One stepped in front of Victoria while the other caught her by the forearm before she could reach Annie. Nate came down from the altar. His height cast a shadow over the woman who had been moments away from becoming his wife. He studied the tremor in her eyes. Victoria, if you are innocent, why are you afraid to let her answer questions? I'm not afraid of her. I'm disgusted by her. Tears spilled down Victoria's cheeks with perfect timing. You are choosing an unknown servant over the woman you were about to marry and the baby inside me. The baby? Nate gave a brief laugh that held no warmth. Then he turned toward Calvin. Open the briefcase. Give me the original DNA report. Calvin's face went white. He stepped back again, gripping the black case against his chest as though it were the last thing keeping him alive. Sir, these are confidential company and personal documents. We cannot open them carelessly in front of employees and guests. Open it. Calvin did not move. Nate's voice filled the chapel. Open the damn case. Every whisper stopped. Calvin lowered the case onto a nearby table. His fingers fumbled with the metal clasps. Before he could release them, Annie spoke again. Wait, Mr. Whitmore. You don't need to search his briefcase. The room turned toward her. Annie reached into the pocket of her uniform and removed a brown paper envelope with one corner torn away. Several pieces of paper showed through the opening, joined with strips of clear tape. Julian stared at it. What is that? His voice came out lower than he intended. This is what I found in the trash can inside the bridal preparation room after Mrs. Langford and Mr. Julian left during an argument, Annie said. Victoria's body stiffened. Annie raised the envelope where Nate could see it and walked toward him with deliberate steps. It contains part of a torn DNA report. It also contains a transfer receipt for $100,000 from an account connected to Julian Whitmore. The payment went directly toward a bank debt in Calvin Ross's name. Calvin's eyes widened. You're lying, his voice cracked. You lying piece of trash. Julian moved before anyone else could respond. She stole it, he said, panic stripping the polish from his voice. She stole private documents from the bridal suite. He lunged toward Annie and reached for the envelope. Nate caught his brother by the wrist. The movement was fast and hard enough to stop Julian in place. For several seconds, the two brothers stood face to face. Julian's hand remained inches from the envelope. Nate looked down at it, then back into his brother's eyes. You were sitting 20 feet away when she said she had evidence, Nate said. How did you know those papers were private? Julian's mouth opened, but no answer came. Nate released him and took the envelope from Annie with both hands. The torn pages trembled slightly. Though whether the movement came from Annie or from him, no one could tell. On the first fragment, he saw his own name. On the second, he saw the laboratory code. Then he saw the incomplete line beneath it. Nathaniel Whitmore is excluded as the biological. The paper ended there. Nate stared at the words until the rest of the chapel disappeared around him. Victoria pressed both hands over her stomach. Nate, you cannot believe this. She could have printed those papers herself. Annie turned toward the side entrance. I didn't ask him to rely on the papers alone. A man in a charcoal suit stood in the open doorway. Daniel Hayes had practiced law long enough to know that entering a room at the correct moment was sometimes more powerful than raising his voice. He carried a sealed document case. Daniel looked first at Nate, then at the envelope in his hands. I verified the laboratory number this morning, he said. The report in that envelope is connected to a legitimate prenatal DNA test. Victoria stopped crying. Calvin's hand slipped away from his briefcase. Daniel walked into the chapel. And the conclusion Mr. Whitmore was given, he continued, does not match the conclusion retained by the laboratory. No one spoke. Outside the glass walls, the church bells began to ring over Charleston. They had been scheduled to celebrate a marriage. Instead, they sounded as the first piece of the truth entered the room. Daniel Hayes crossed the center aisle without hurrying. The church bells continued outside, each note striking the glass walls and returning as a faint echo. Nate held the torn report in one hand. He looked at Daniel. How certain are you? Certain enough to stop this ceremony. Not yet certain enough to accuse anyone in this room of a crime. Victoria let out a sharp breath. There. Even your own lawyer admits he has nothing. Daniel turned toward her. I said the investigation is not complete. I did not say there is nothing. Calvin reached for the leather case on the table. Leave it, Nate said. Calvin's hand stopped above the handle. Sir, these documents contain confidential information. That is why you will leave them where they are. Nate looked toward the head of security. Mr. Porter, close the chapel doors. No member of the household staff is to touch my study. No one enters it until Daniel and I are present. The older guard hesitated. What about the guests, sir? They may move to the reception hall. Ask them to remain on the property until we determine whether the police need statements. The mention of police changed the room. Phones lowered. Conversations became quieter. Several guests who had treated the interruption as entertainment now looked toward the exits. Victoria stepped closer to Nate. You cannot detain 200 people because a maid found torn paper in a trash can. I'm not detaining anyone. I'm asking my guests to remain for a short time. And if they refuse, they are free to leave. Their names will be recorded. Julian gave a bitter laugh. You are turning your own wedding into a criminal investigation. Nate looked at him. You tried to take the evidence from her hand. I was stopping a thief. You called the documents private before you had seen them. Julian's jaw tightened. Anyone could assume they were private. She said she found them in the bridal suite. Annie watched them from beside the aisle. The anger that had carried her into the chapel was fading, leaving her aware of how many people were staring. She could feel sweat beneath the collar of her borrowed uniform. Her knees had begun to shake. Daniel noticed. Miss Carter, did you give me every piece you found? Yes, sir. Did you make copies? One copy. I gave it to you this morning. Did anyone see you take the envelope? I don't know. Victoria turned toward Nate. Listen to her. She searched my trash, stole private papers, copied them, and met your lawyer behind our backs. I did not search your room, Annie said. I was assigned to clean it. You went through my garbage. I emptied the wastebasket. The envelope was on top. You expect us to believe you recognized a financial crime from a torn receipt? No. I recognized your name, Mr. Whitmore's name, and the word excluded. Then I took it to someone who understood the rest. Daniel gave Annie a slight nod. Her answer had been direct and contained no claim beyond what she could prove. Nate looked at the fragment again. The black lettering seemed ordinary. That was what disturbed him most. A lie large enough to alter his life had arrived on standard laboratory paper in a folder Calvin had placed on his desk. Where is the report you gave me? Nate asked. Calvin did not answer at once. In your study, sir. Where? The locked medical file behind your desk. And the key? I have one. You have the other. Nate reached inside his jacket and removed a narrow key from his wallet. Calvin's gaze dropped toward it. Daniel saw the movement. Does anyone else have access? No, Calvin said. Nate looked at him. That was not your question to answer. Calvin lowered his head. No one else should have access. Should? The cleaning staff do not enter without permission. Security logs the door. I manage the records. Annie thought of Victoria's warning in the hallway and the certainty in her voice when she had spoken about the study. She opened her mouth, then stopped. Nate noticed. What else? Victoria moved between them. Do not question her here like she is some kind of witness. She is a witness. She is a child. I'm 18, Annie said. Victoria ignored her. Nate, look at me. I am carrying your baby. You know the dates. You attended the appointments. Nate's eyes remained on Annie. What else did you hear? Annie took the blue handkerchief from her pocket and pressed it between both hands. I heard Mrs. Langford tell Mr. Julian that the false test and the transfer records had been hidden in your study. The whispering returned. Margaret closed her eyes. Julian stepped forward. That is a lie. Annie looked at him. You were worried Calvin would keep a copy. You said a man like him would never destroy the only paper that could protect him. Calvin turned toward Julian. The reaction was immediate. Not surprise at the accusation. Anger that Annie knew the sentence. Julian saw it too. Don't look at me like that, he said. Calvin's face hardened. I said nothing. You were paid to make sure there was nothing left. Victoria's voice cut between them. Both of you, stop. The command came too late. The three of them had spoken as though Annie, Nate, Daniel, and 200 guests were no longer in the room. Nate's expression changed. The confusion did not disappear, but something colder settled over it. Daniel closed the document case in his hand. Mr. Whitmore, I recommend we separate them immediately. Victoria stared at him. Separate us? On whose authority? On mine, Nate said. He pointed toward the side rooms behind the chapel. Victoria goes to the bridal sitting room. Julian goes to the minister's office. Calvin remains here until security takes possession of that case. You cannot treat me like a criminal, Julian said. I've not called you one. You are letting a servant turn you against your own blood. Nate stepped close enough that Julian lowered his voice. My blood is not on trial, Nate said. Your conduct is. Mr. Porter directed 2 guards toward Julian. Another approached Calvin, who reluctantly removed his hands from the briefcase. Victoria remained where she was. Nate, she said, softer now. Please, think about what this stress is doing to the baby. For the first time, Nate looked at her stomach without tenderness. If the child is mine, I will protect it. Victoria's lower lip trembled. And if it isn't? Nate did not answer. Daniel turned to Annie. Stay with Mrs. Bell until I ask for you. Do not speak to the press. Do not answer questions from guests. Do not go anywhere alone. Annie glanced toward Victoria. Emmy in danger? The question silenced the people nearest them. Daniel did not offer false comfort. I don't know. Nate looked at the young woman who had entered his chapel with nothing but torn paper and a warning. He understood, perhaps for the first time, what it had cost her to walk down that aisle. You will remain under my protection until we know, he said. Annie's face tightened. My mother is at the hospital. I will have someone brought to her. No, Annie's answer came quickly. Not someone chosen by Mr. Ross. Calvin flinched. Nate gave a slow nod. Daniel will choose. Outside, the bell stopped. The sudden absence of sound felt heavier than the ringing had. Nate picked up the leather briefcase and handed it to Daniel. Let's open the study. As they left the chapel, Nate did not look back at the altar. The white flowers, the waiting vows, and the future he had imagined remained behind him. Ahead was a locked room containing either proof that Annie had destroyed his wedding with a lie, or proof that everyone closest to him had built the wedding around one. The walk from the chapel to Nate's study took less than 2 minutes, but no one spoke. Daniel carried Calvin's leather briefcase. Nate walked beside him with the torn DNA report folded once in his hand. 2 security officers followed. Behind them came Mr. Porter, then Annie with Mrs. Bell at her side. The hallway had been decorated for the reception. White roses climbed the banisters, and framed photographs of Nate and Victoria stood on narrow tables beneath the windows. In one picture, Victoria was laughing with her hand on Nate's arm. In another, Julian stood behind them with a champagne glass raised. Nate passed each image without turning his head. At the study door, he removed the narrow key from his wallet and inserted it into the lock. It would not turn. He tried again. Daniel looked at him. Are you certain that is the right key? I've used it for 12 years. Mr. Porter stepped closer. The lock may have been changed. Nate turned toward him. Without my authorization? No, sir. Daniel set the briefcase on a side table. Who has authority to request maintenance on this room? Mr. Ross, Porter said. Or you? Nate stared at the lock for a moment, then stepped aside. Open it. Porter called for the estate locksmith, but Annie moved closer before he could finish the call. Mr. Whitmore, Nate looked at her. When Mrs. Langford threatened me, she said the papers had already been hidden in your study. She sounded certain no one would find them before the wedding. Daniel examined the keyhole. Then they may have planned for this door to remain closed. Nate nodded once. Break it. Porter hesitated only a second. One of the guards brought a short steel bar from a security cabinet at the end of the hall. The first strike damaged the brass plate. The second split the wood beside the lock. On the third, the door opened inward. The room looked untouched. Nate's desk stood beneath the windows facing the ocean. His reading glasses rested beside a cold cup of coffee. A silver-framed photograph of his late wife remained where it had always been. The shelves, curtains, and lamps gave no sign that anyone had entered. But the smell was wrong. Nate stopped just inside. What is it? Daniel asked. Furniture polish. Mrs. Bell leaned forward. The study wasn't scheduled for cleaning today. Annie looked toward the desk. The surface reflected the light too evenly. Someone had wiped it. Daniel put on a pair of gloves from his case. No one touches anything else. He directed Porter to photograph the room before they moved farther inside. Then he asked Nate to show him the medical file. Nate crossed to a tall cabinet behind the desk. The lower drawer had a separate lock. This key worked. Inside were property records, insurance policies, medical files, and sealed folders arranged by year. Nate pulled out the most recent medical folder. The DNA report was not there. He checked again, slower this time. Daniel stood beside him. What should the file contain? The laboratory report Calvin gave me, Victoria's prenatal records, and the signed authorization for the test. Nothing else? No. The folder held the authorization form and copies of 2 appointment summaries. The report itself was missing. Nate turned toward the doorway. Bring Calvin here. Porter spoke into his radio. Annie watched Nate place the file on his desk. His hands were steady, but the muscles along his jaw had hardened. He looked less like a groom now than the chairman whose decisions could close a division before lunch. Daniel opened Calvin's briefcase, while Porter photographed each step. Inside were the marriage documents, a tablet, 2 phones, a set of keys, and several sealed folders. There was no DNA report. Daniel removed 1 document at a time. The first was a prenuptial agreement. The second was a medical power of attorney. The third was an amendment granting Victoria temporary voting control over Nate's shares if 2 physicians declared him unable to manage his affairs. Nate picked up the amendment. I never approved this language. Daniel read the final page. Your signature is not here. It was supposed to be signed after the ceremony. Yes. Annie looked at the stack. Would Mrs. Langford have controlled the company? Not immediately, Daniel said, but she would have been able to act in his name under certain conditions. What conditions? Daniel looked at Nate before answering. If he became ill, confused, or legally incapacitated. Nate's eyes moved toward the cold coffee on his desk. Daniel followed the glance. Do you feel unwell? No. Have you felt unwell recently? Nate did not answer at once. Dizzy twice this month. I assumed I had skipped lunch. Daniel's expression changed. Who manages your prescriptions? Calvin collects them. Victoria reminds me to take them. Mrs. Bell crossed herself. Annie looked at the coffee again. Did anyone bring that cup? Nate pointed toward the service bell near the desk. A tray was here when I came in this morning. Mrs. Bell shook her head. Not from my staff. The wedding kitchen did not send service to this room. Daniel told Porter to secure the cup. Calvin arrived between 2 guards. His jacket was open now, and the color had not returned to his face. He stopped at the broken door. What have you done? Nate held up the empty medical folder. Where is the report? Calvin looked from the folder to Daniel's open case. I told you. It should be in the cabinet. It isn't. Then someone removed it. Who? I don't know. Nate placed the unsigned amendment on the desk. Did you prepare this? Calvin glanced at it. Outside counsel did. Daniel spoke without looking up. No, they did not. The document number belongs to a draft my office rejected 2 weeks ago. Calvin's mouth tightened. Daniel continued. The final version removed temporary voting control. This copy restores it. That could be an administrative error. An administrative error that benefits Victoria, Julian, and you? Calvin looked toward Annie. This is what she wants. She wants everyone blaming each other. Annie said nothing. Nate stepped around the desk. For 20 years. I never asked you to prove where you had been. I never checked a document after you told me it was correct. I let you speak for me in rooms I did not enter. Calvin lifted his chin. Because I earned that trust. Then answer one question. Nate held up the torn transfer receipt. Why did Julian pay $100,000 toward your bank debt? Calvin's eyes flicked toward the paper and away. It was a loan. A loan for what? A personal matter. From my brother? Yes. When? Calvin hesitated. Daniel answered for him. 4 days before the DNA report was delivered. The silence in the room changed. Calvin looked at Daniel with open hatred. You had no right to access my finances. I did not. The receipt came from the envelope Annie found. Calvin turned on her. You have no idea what you've started. Annie's fear showed this time, but she did not move behind Mrs. Bell. Nate stepped between them. No, she ended something. A guard's radio crackled. Porter listened, then looked at Nate. Sir, Mrs. Langford is demanding to leave. Mr. Julian is with her. I ordered them separated. They refused. Mrs. Whitmore allowed Julian into the bridal sitting room. Nate closed his eyes for 1 second. His family, his assistant, his bride. Every person who should have been waiting for the truth was already moving against it. Lock the east gate, he said. No vehicles leave. Daniel gathered the papers. We should call the authorities now. Nate looked at the unsigned amendment, the missing report, and the cup of coffee no one admitted bringing. Yes. Then Annie spoke from behind him. Mr. Whitmore, there is one more thing I heard. He turned. Mr. Julian said Calvin would never destroy the only paper that could keep him alive. Calvin's face became still. Not frightened, calculating. Daniel saw it and reached for the second phone from the briefcase. The screen lit before he touched it. One message had just arrived. Burn the backup. Now. Daniel lifted Calvin's second phone from the briefcase and turned the screen toward Nate. Burn the backup. Now. The message had come from a number saved only as J. Julian. No one in the study spoke. Calvin looked at the screen, then at Nate. Anyone could have sent that. Daniel's expression did not change. Anyone whose name begins with J? It could be fabricated. The message arrived while the phone was in our custody. Calvin's breathing grew shallow. Then Julian sent it without knowing what he was saying. Nate stepped closer. What backup? There is no backup. Then why does my brother want it burned? I don't know. You have used that answer 3 times in 5 minutes. Nate took the phone from Daniel. The message remained on the screen, plain and brief. He had spent years reading between the lines of contracts and quarterly reports. This required no interpretation. Reply, he said. Daniel looked at him. What do you want to say? Nate thought for a moment. Ask where. Daniel typed with gloved hands. Where? The reply came less than 10 seconds later. Old records room. West Service Hall. Top cabinet. Use the blue key. Everyone looked at Calvin. Porter removed the key ring from Calvin's briefcase and spread it across the desk. Among the brass and silver keys was one painted blue at the head. Calvin closed his eyes. Nate's voice softened, which made it more dangerous. 20 years. Calvin opened his eyes again. 20 years, Nate repeated. And this is how it ends? With a painted key? Calvin said nothing. Daniel pointed toward Porter. Take 2 officers. Photograph the cabinet before opening it. No one touches the contents without gloves. Porter selected the blue key. I'm coming, Nate said. Daniel shook his head. You should remain here. It is my house. It may also be a crime scene. Nate looked at Calvin, then handed the phone back to Daniel. Fine, you go. I want a live video feed. Porter and the 2 guards left through the broken doorway. Daniel set one of the phones upright against a stack of books and connected it to Porter's body camera. The screen showed the West Service Hall as they moved through the house. Wedding flowers lined the corridor, but the staff had begun clearing trays and closing doors. Guests were being directed toward the reception hall, where no music played. Annie stood near Mrs. Bell, watching the video. The old records room was narrow and windowless. Metal cabinets filled both walls. Porter stopped at the tallest one. Top cabinet, Daniel said. Porter raised the blue key. It fit. Inside was a gray fireproof box. Calvin moved suddenly. One of the guards caught him before he reached the desk, but the chair struck the floor, and the coffee cup tipped from its saucer. Don't touch that box, Calvin shouted. The room went still. Nate looked at him. You said there was no backup. Calvin's face had lost whatever control remained. You don't understand what is in there. Then explain it. It is not what you think. That sentence has never made an innocent man sound innocent. On the video, Porter lifted the box from the cabinet and placed it on a table. The blue key opened that lock as well. Inside were 3 folders, a flash drive, and a sealed laboratory envelope. Daniel leaned closer to the screen. Read the label. Porter held the envelope toward the camera. Nathaniel Whitmore Prenatal Paternity Analysis. Nate's hand closed around the edge of his desk. Bring it here. Calvin twisted against the guard's grip. Nathaniel, listen to me. I was going to tell you. When? After the wedding? After I signed the documents? Calvin looked toward the floor. Nate nodded once, as if an answer had been given. Porter returned several minutes later carrying the fireproof box. He placed it before Daniel, who photographed the seal on the laboratory envelope before opening it. The report contained 7 pages. Daniel reviewed the identification numbers first. Then the dates, sample codes, and laboratory signatures. He turned to the final page and stopped. Nate did not ask immediately. Annie watched his face. A man who had built his life around control was now waiting for someone else to tell him whether the future he imagined had ever existed. Daniel placed the report on the desk. The samples matched the codes on the torn document. And the result? Daniel met his eyes. "You are excluded as the biological father." The words did not strike Nate all at once. They seemed to enter the room slowly, touching the wedding photographs, the unsigned power of attorney, the cold coffee, and the silver-framed picture of his late wife. He looked down at the final line. Probability of paternity, 0%. Victoria had placed his hand over her stomach in the rose garden 3 months earlier. She had cried when he promised to convert the East Nursery. She had watched him choose a wooden crib from a craftsman in North Carolina. She had let him speak to the child at night. He had believed every moment. Nate removed the chain from beneath his shirt. His first wife's wedding ring hung from it. He set it beside the report and pressed 2 fingers against the desk. Daniel gave him several seconds before opening the first folder from the box. It contained bank records. A transfer of $100,000 from a holding company controlled by Julian had paid down Calvin's private debt. A second payment of $250,000 had gone to an account in the Cayman Islands. A third payment was scheduled for the Monday after the wedding. The second folder contained copies of Nate's recent medical files and a draft letter declaring that he had shown signs of confusion, memory loss, and impaired judgment. The physician's signature line was blank. The third folder held a revised trust agreement naming Victoria as temporary controller of Nate's voting shares and Julian as manager of the unborn child's inheritance. Nate read each name: Victoria, Julian, Calvin, his bride, his brother, and the man who had managed his life for 2 decades. Annie looked toward Calvin. Was the coffee part of it? Calvin's eyes moved to the cup. That was enough. Daniel immediately told Porter to seal it as evidence. Nate stepped away from the desk. "What was in my medication?" Calvin remained silent. "What did you give me?" "I never touched your medication." "Then who did?" Calvin's jaw tightened. Daniel opened the flash drive on an isolated laptop from his case. A list of files appeared. Emails, bank statements, medical notes, 1 audio recording. The file name read, "After the ceremony." Daniel clicked it. Victoria's voice filled the study. "Once he signs, we wait 2 weeks. The medication will make the doctor's report believable," Julian answered. "And if Calvin panics?" "He won't. He knows what happens if he talks." The recording ended. Annie felt Mrs. Bell's hand close around her shoulder. Nate did not move for several seconds. Then Porter's radio came alive. "East Gate to command. Gray Range Rover just breached the service barrier. 2 occupants, heading toward Harbor Road." Julian's car. Nate looked toward the doorway. "Victoria?" Porter listened to the response. "Yes, sir, she's with him." Nate picked up his jacket. Daniel blocked his path. "The police are already moving. They have my brother, my bride, and evidence of an attempt to drug me. They also may be armed." Nate's face hardened. "Then make sure the police reach them before I do." Behind him, Calvin began to laugh. It was a small, broken sound. Nate turned. "What is funny?" Calvin looked toward the flash drive. "You still think they are running from the evidence?" Daniel's hand paused above the keyboard. Calvin's smile disappeared. "They are running toward the only person who can prove who the child's real father is." Nate stopped at the doorway. "The child's real father?" he repeated. Calvin's eyes moved from Nate to Daniel, then toward the guards holding him. Whatever loyalty he had once performed was gone. What remained was a tired man calculating how much his silence was still worth. "You heard the recording," he said. "Julian was afraid I kept copies. Victoria was afraid of something else." Daniel closed the laptop. "Who are they going to see?" Calvin said nothing. Nate stepped closer. "You have one chance to help yourself." Calvin gave a hollow smile. "You cannot promise me immunity." "No, but I can make sure the prosecutor knows whether you helped prevent another crime or watched it happen." The smile faded. "There is a doctor," Calvin said. "Dr. Warren Pike. He handled the prenatal test." Daniel frowned. "The laboratory physician?" "No, Victoria's private obstetrician. He collected the samples and arranged the chain of custody. The laboratory received the correct specimens, but Pike kept a second sample from Julian." Annie's eyes narrowed. "So the doctor already knew Julian was the father?" "He knew enough to suspect it. He agreed to keep quiet." "For money?" Nate asked. "For money at first." "And now?" Calvin looked at the message on the phone. Now he wants more. Daniel stepped toward him. Where is Pike? His private clinic near Harbor Road. He lives above it. Porter immediately spoke into his radio, relaying the address to Charleston police. Nate looked toward the windows. The reception tent outside had begun to empty. Guests were being directed toward their cars in small groups, while security recorded names. A wedding had become a controlled evacuation. Why would Julian and Victoria go to Pike now? Nate asked. Calvin's answer came quietly. Because he has the original sample that proves Julian is the father. If he gives it to the police, their story collapses. If he disappears with it, they can keep arguing the laboratory made a mistake. Daniel shook his head. The financial records already connect them. They think they can explain the money. A loan, a consulting fee, a family transfer. They cannot explain the child. Nate turned to Porter. How far ahead are they? 8 minutes, maybe 10. Patrol units are approaching from the south. I'm going. Daniel blocked the doorway again. No, this concerns my family. It concerns an active criminal investigation. You are a potential victim, and your presence could make the situation worse. Nate's patience thinned. They are going after a doctor who may be a witness, and the police know that now. Annie spoke from beside Mrs. Bell. Mr. Hayes is right. Nate turned toward her. She looked pale, but her voice remained level. They already used your trust against you. Don't let them use your anger too. For a moment, Nate seemed surprised that she had challenged him. Then he looked toward the broken study door, the altered documents, and the coffee cup sealed inside an evidence bag. He removed his jacket and placed it over the back of a chair. Keep me informed every minute. Porter nodded. Calvin lowered his head. Nate saw the movement. What else? Nothing. You looked relieved when I agreed to stay. Calvin's shoulders tightened. Daniel studied him. Pike is not at the clinic, is he? Calvin did not answer. Daniel picked up the second phone and searched the recent calls. One number had been contacted 4 times that morning. Another appeared twice, under no name. He called it on speaker. The line rang 6 times before a man answered. Calvin, Daniel said. This is Daniel Hayes. Who is this? The caller disconnected. Porter checked the number through security. It's registered to a marina office, he said. Cooper River, North Dock. Calvin closed his eyes again. Nate stepped in front of him. Tell me now. They moved Pike last night, Calvin said. Julian did not trust the clinic. Pike is waiting on a boat. What boat? A white cabin cruiser called Second Chance. Who chose that name? Annie asked. Calvin looked at her. Victoria. Porter sent the new location. Daniel reopened the financial files while the officers coordinated. He found a payment from one of Julian's companies to the marina for a 3-month berth. Another payment covered fuel and maintenance. They planned an exit route, he said. Nate looked at the schedule. Was this always part of the plan? No, Calvin answered. The boat was insurance. If you questioned the test before the wedding, they would leave the state. If you signed, they would stay. And after they had control of the company, Calvin did not look up. You were supposed to become too sick to challenge them. Mrs. Bell made a sound under her breath. Annie thought of the untouched coffee, the false medical letter, and Victoria's hand placed carefully over a child she had turned into leverage. Nate walked to the window. Outside, workers were removing white flowers from the path between the house and chapel. One man carried an entire arrangement in both arms, petals falling behind him across the stone. Nate had chosen those flowers because his first wife loved gardenias. Victoria had insisted on roses instead. He had thought it was a small compromise. Now every small compromise seemed to have a second meaning. Porter's radio crackled. Units arriving at Cooper River Marina. Gray Range Rover located. Driver's door open. No occupants. Nate turned. What about the boat? Porter listened. Second Chance is still at the dock. Cabin door closed. No visible movement. Daniel said, tell them to wait for tactical support. Porter relayed the instruction. The silence in the study stretched. Annie could hear the faint sounds of staff clearing glassware from the reception hall. Somewhere in the kitchen, a tray fell and someone cursed. The ordinary work of the house continued around the collapse of Nate's private life. A second radio transmission came through. Movement inside the cabin. One male seen through the port window. Possible weapon. Nate's hand closed around the windowsill. Pike? Unknown. Then another voice came over the radio, louder and less controlled. Shots fired. Officer down. Suspects moving toward the fuel dock. Mrs. Bell pulled Annie closer. Nate took one step toward the door before Daniel caught his arm. You cannot help them from here. Porter raised a hand for silence as more information came through. 2 suspects running east. Female in white dress, male in dark suit. 3rd individual inside the boat. Victoria and Julian. The officers shouted through the radio. Sirens rose in the distance. Then came the sound of an engine turning over. Porter's face changed. The boat is moving. Nate stared at him. With Pike on board? Before Porter could answer, the radio erupted with overlapping voices. Suspect vehicle blocked. Female detained. Male suspect jumped onto the vessel. Boat pulling away from dock. Possible hostage inside. Nate looked at Calvin. Julian is taking Pike. Calvin's face had gone gray. No, he whispered. What? Calvin's voice broke. Pike isn't the hostage. Daniel stepped closer. Then who is? Calvin looked toward Annie. Her mother. Annie stared at Calvin as if the room had shifted beneath her. What did you say? Calvin looked away. Nate crossed the distance between them and seized the front of his shirt. Why is Ruth Carter on that boat? The guards moved, but Daniel raised a hand. Let him answer. Calvin's voice came out thin. Victoria needed leverage. Against whom? Annie demanded. Against you. The words struck harder than Annie expected. For a moment she could hear only the blood rushing in her ears. Mrs. Bell tightened her arm around Annie's shoulders. Ruth was at the hospital. She was, Calvin said. Julian arranged a private medical transport. He used Whitmore credentials and told the nurses she was being moved to another facility for a specialist consultation. Annie pulled away from Mrs. Bell. That hospital would never release her without calling me. They called the number listed as her emergency contact. My number is listed. Calvin swallowed. It was changed yesterday. Annie's face went still. Nate released Calvin so suddenly that he stumbled backward into the guard. Who changed it? Victoria told me to update the employee medical file. I entered Julian's number under a false name. You handed a sick woman to them, Nate said. I didn't know they would take her today. You built the door. Do not pretend you are innocent because someone else walked through it. Porter's radio crackled again. The boat had cleared the marina and was heading south along the Cooper River. Harbor Patrol was moving to intercept, but Julian had Ruth inside and had already threatened to harm her if officers approached too closely. Annie moved toward the door. Daniel stepped in front of her. Where are you going? To the marina. No, that is my mother. And Julian is armed. I don't care. You will when he sees you and decides you are more useful than she is. Annie stopped. She hated him for being right. Nate turned to Porter. Get me the harbor commander. Porter made the call and handed Nate the phone. This is Nathaniel Whitmore. Julian Whitmore is my brother. The woman on that boat is Ruth Carter, 46 years old, in active treatment for kidney failure. She may be weak from dialysis and may require medication. Do not force the vessel into a collision. A voice answered through the speaker, calm and direct. Mr. Whitmore, we have 2 patrol boats shadowing at a distance. Coast Guard is responding. We need to know whether your brother has boating experience. He does. How much? He spent summers on the water since childhood. He knows the river, the inlets, and the private docks. Any destination he might use? Nate looked toward the harbor map framed on the study wall. Julian had grown up beside him. They had fished the same creeks, hidden from their father in the same abandoned boathouses, and learned which channels became too shallow at low tide. There is an old Whitmore landing south of Drum Island, Nate said. It belonged to our grandfather. The dock was damaged years ago, but a small cabin cruiser could still reach it near high tide. Porter relayed the coordinates. Annie watched Nate speak with the precision of a man solving a business crisis, but she saw the anger in his hand around the phone. His knuckles had gone white. What will happen when they reach the landing? She asked when the call ended. If Julian remembers it, he may transfer to a vehicle or hide in the old storage building. My mother cannot walk far. I know. No, you don't. Annie's voice rose for the first time. She finished dialysis this morning. She gets dizzy if she stands too quickly. She has medication every 4 hours. If they took her without her bag, Mrs. Bell interrupted gently. Annie, breathe. I am breathing. You are trying to speak faster than your body can. Annie pressed both hands against the desk. The blue handkerchief was still clenched between her fingers. Nate approached, but stopped several feet away. What does she need? Annie looked at him. Tell me exactly. Her blood pressure medication is in a white bottle. She has anti-nausea tablets in a small blue case. She needs water, but not too much at once. She cannot miss her evening dose. If she becomes confused or starts shaking, she needs medical help. Daniel wrote everything down and sent it to the harbor commander. Calvin began to speak. Julian would not hurt her. Annie turned on him. You don't get to say that. He only wants the evidence. He stole a woman from a hospital. He is frightened. So am I. I did not kidnap anyone. Calvin lowered his eyes. The phone on Daniel's desk rang. Porter answered, listened, then held it toward Nate. Julian is calling from the boat. Nate took the phone and switched it to speaker. Wind and engine noise filled the room. Nate, Julian said, put Ruth on. You don't give orders anymore. Put her on the phone. A pause followed. Then a woman's weak voice came through. Annie? Annie rushed closer. Mom, I'm here. Baby, where are you? At Whitmore House. Are you hurt? No, I'm tired. Do you have your medicine? They took my bag. Annie closed her eyes. Mom, listen to me. Stay sitting down. Don't stand unless someone helps you. Take small breaths. Ruth gave a faint laugh. I know how to breathe. The sound broke something in Annie's face. Julian returned to the line. Now you know she is alive. Nate's voice hardened. What do you want? The envelope, the flash drive, and every copy Daniel made. You know that is impossible. Then Ruth gets sicker. Annie grabbed the phone from Nate. You touch her, and there will be nowhere left for you to hide. Julian laughed once. You are in no position to threaten me. You kidnapped a sick woman because you were afraid of an 18-year-old maid. I think that tells us exactly what position you are in. The room went silent. Julian's breathing changed. Nate reached for the phone, but Annie held it tighter. You want the evidence? She continued. Then talk to me, not Mr. Whitmore. Daniel shook his head, warning her to stop. Julian said, Why would I talk to you? Because I found the papers. I know where the original pieces are. Daniel does not have everything. It was a lie. Daniel's eyes narrowed, but he understood what she was doing. What pieces? Julian asked. The part of the transfer receipt with the routing number. The section of the report with the second sample code. I kept them separate. Nate studied Annie. She looked terrified, but her voice had become steady. Julian lowered the engine speed. The noise behind him softened. Where are they? Somewhere you cannot reach unless I take you there. Annie, Ruth said faintly in the background. Don't. Annie closed her eyes for 1 second. I'm not trading myself, she said. I'm trading information. You let my mother go at the old landing, and I tell you where the pieces are. How do I know you're not lying? You don't. That must be difficult for a man who built his entire plan on lies. Julian said nothing. Daniel wrote a message on a legal pad and turned it toward her. Keep him talking. Annie nodded almost imperceptibly. On the other end of the line, a second voice spoke. Dr. Pike. Julian, the patrol boats are getting closer. I know. Ruth coughed. Annie's control nearly broke. Let me speak to her again. No. Then you have nothing to bargain with. Julian's voice sharpened. You are forgetting who has your mother. And you are forgetting she is the only reason the police have not boarded you. Nate looked at Annie differently then. Not as a maid. Not as a frightened witness. But as the only person in the room Julian had not prepared to face. The radio came alive behind Porter. The harbor commander had located the boat near Drum Island. Coast Guard units were moving ahead to block the southern channel. Julian must have heard something through his own radio, because the engine suddenly rose. You lied, he said. No, Annie replied. I kept you talking. He cursed and ended the call. Porter listened to the next transmission. The vessel changed direction. It's heading toward the old Whitmore landing. Nate reached for his jacket. This time Daniel did not block him. You cannot go alone, the lawyer said. I'm not going alone. Annie stepped forward. I'm coming. Nate looked at her. No, that is my mother. And that is my brother. Annie met his eyes. Then we both have someone on that boat we thought we knew. Outside, The last wedding guests were leaving through the gates as Nate, Annie, Daniel, and the security team headed toward the waiting vehicles. The white flowers still lined the drive. By nightfall, no one would remember them as wedding flowers. They would remember them as the path Annie Carter crossed on her way to bring her mother home. The Lincoln Navigator left Whitmore House with 2 security vehicles behind it. Nate sat in the front passenger seat beside Porter. Annie and Daniel were in the second row, while Mrs. Bell stayed behind to coordinate with the hospital and Ruth's doctors. No one spoke during the first mile. The white flowers along the drive gave way to live oaks, then to the narrow road leading toward the river. Evening light stretched across the marsh. Annie held her mother's blue handkerchief so tightly that the fabric had twisted around her fingers. Daniel ended a call with the Coast Guard and turned toward her. They have Julian's boat on radar. He is less than 15 minutes from the old landing. And my mother? They have not seen her through the windows. That does not answer me. No, Daniel said. It does not. Nate looked back from the front seat. The landing has 1 dock and an old storage house. There is no road access from the south. Julian will have to use the North Service Road if he wants a vehicle. Porter spoke without taking his eyes off the road. Local police are blocking that route now. Will he see them? Annie asked. If they position correctly, no. She looked out the window. He knows this property better than they do. So do I, Nate said. His voice did not sound proud. The old Whitmore landing had once been part of the family's shipping business. Nate and Julian had spent summers there with their father, learning to tie lines and read the tide charts. Their father had believed every boy should know how to bring a boat home without an engine. Nate remembered Julian at 12, laughing as he jumped from the dock into water their father had forbidden them to enter. He remembered pulling him out by the collar and taking the blame when their father saw the wet clothes. He had spent 40 years stepping between Julian and consequences. Now Ruth Carter was paying for it. The Coast Guard commander called through Porter's speaker. The vessel is slowing near the landing. We have visual confirmation of 3 people aboard. One appears to be an older female seated inside the cabin. Annie leaned forward. Can you tell whether she is conscious? She is moving. Annie closed her eyes briefly. There is also a male at the wheel and another male near the stern. The commander continued. We believe the second man is Dr. Pike. Is he armed? Nate asked. Unknown. We are holding our distance because Whitmore threatened the hostage. The convoy turned from the main road onto a gravel service route. Marsh grass brushed both sides of the vehicles. Ahead, the river appeared between the trees, dark under the lowering sun. Daniel leaned toward Annie. When we arrive, you stay in the car until law enforcement clears you to move. If my mother comes off that boat, they will bring her to you. And if Julian asks for me, you do not go. Annie looked at Nate. He did not turn around. Daniel is right. You let me speak to him before. That was over a phone. It worked. It also made him angry enough to accelerate with your sick mother aboard. Annie's voice tightened. I kept him talking long enough for them to find him. And now trained officers will handle the rest. She stared at the back of his seat. You are going to get out of this car? Yes. Then do not tell me it is too dangerous. Nate turned at last. I am the person Julian wants to punish. You are the person he wants to silence. Those are different dangers. They do not feel different from here. Daniel spoke before Nate could answer. Both of you are staying behind the command line, unless the Coast Guard says otherwise. That is not a discussion. The vehicle stopped beneath a row of pines half a mile from the dock. Police cruisers waited with their lights off. An ambulance stood near the trees. Its rear doors open. A paramedic had already received Ruth's medical information. Porter led Nate, Annie, and Daniel toward the mobile command post. The old storage building was visible through the branches. Beyond it, the white cabin cruiser approached the dock at low speed. Julian stood at the wheel. Dr. Pike remained near the stern, one hand gripping the railing. Ruth sat inside the cabin with her head against the wall. Annie took one step forward. A Coast Guard officer stopped her with an open palm. Please remain here. That is my mother. I know. We will bring her out. The boat's engine dropped to idle. Julian did not tie the vessel to the dock. He kept it several feet away, using short bursts of throttle to hold position against the current. Nate took a radio from the commander. Julian. His voice carried through the loudspeaker mounted near the landing. Julian looked toward the trees. You came. Let Ruth go. Send Annie to the dock with the envelope and flash drive. Annie reached for the radio, but Daniel caught her wrist. Nate continued. You know the police already have copies. I know what Daniel has. I do not know what the girl kept. She told you that to keep you talking. Julian looked toward the cabin. Annie saw Ruth try to sit straighter. You brought her here for nothing, Nate said. Release her before this becomes worse. Julian laughed, but the sound carried strain. Worse for whom? The great Nathaniel Whitmore, the man who always gets to decide what everyone else deserves? This is not about me anymore. It has always been about you. Dr. Pike moved closer to Julian and said something the microphone did not catch. Julian shoved him away. Nate lowered the radio and asked the commander, Can your people take the boat? Not without risking Mrs. Carter. The current is pushing them toward the damaged side of the dock. Annie watched the gap between the boat and the wooden pilings. The tide lifted and lowered the vessel. My mother cannot jump that distance. No one is asking her to, the commander said. Then Ruth moved. She placed one hand against the cabin doorway and tried to stand. Her knees failed. She dropped back into the seat. Annie broke away from Daniel and moved closer to the command line. Mum. Ruth's head lifted at the sound. Julian saw Annie. His expression changed. There she is, he called. Bring me the evidence, or the boat leaves. Annie took the radio from Nate before anyone stopped her. You let my mother step onto the dock first. You are not making the rules. You need me alive and close enough to tell you where the rest is. There is no rest. Nate already said you lied. Annie forced herself not to look at him. Nate does not know where I put everything. Julian hesitated. Daniel whispered, Do not promise to go aboard. Annie nodded once. She raised the radio again. Move the boat against the dock. Let Dr. Pike help my mother off. When she reaches the ambulance, I walk halfway down the pier and tell you where the second copy is. Julian looked toward the patrol boats holding position upriver. No tricks. You kidnapped a woman after dialysis. You are not in a position to complain about tricks. Nate closed his eyes for a moment. Even now, Annie would not let fear make her sound small. Julian ordered Pike to move forward. The doctor took a line and looped it around a piling. The cruiser struck the dock once, hard enough to shake Ruth inside the cabin. Annie moved before the officers could stop her. She walked toward the pier. Nate caught up and took her arm. You agreed to remain here. I agreed to get my mother back. If he reaches for you, I cannot protect both of you. She looked at his hand on her arm. Then do not protect me by stopping me. Nate released her. Annie walked to the beginning of the pier and stopped. Dr. Pike entered the cabin. A moment later, he emerged with Ruth's arm over his shoulder. She looked smaller than Annie had ever seen her. Easy, Annie called. Mom, keep your eyes on me. Ruth lifted her head. Julian stood behind them with a handgun held low against his leg. Pike helped Ruth onto the dock. One step, then another. When they reached the middle of the pier, Julian raised the gun. Stop. Pike froze. Ruth swayed beside him. Julian looked at Annie. Now, you come forward. Annie did not move. My mother reaches the ambulance first. No, that was the deal. I changed it. Nate raised the radio. Julian, put the weapon down. You always did love giving orders. The boat shifted against the pilings. Dr. Pike looked toward the officers hidden in the trees. Julian saw the glance and turned the gun toward him. Pike panicked. He shoved Ruth away and ran. Ruth fell against the edge of the dock. Annie screamed and rushed forward. At the same moment, Julian fired. The shot struck the wooden railing beside Pike, sending splinters into the air. Coast Guard officers moved from both sides. Julian fired again, then jumped back onto the cruiser and pushed the throttle forward. The line snapped tight, tearing a section from the damaged dock before sliding free. Nate reached Ruth first. He caught her beneath the arms before she rolled into the water. Annie dropped beside them. Mom, look at me. Ruth's eyes opened. You came, she whispered. Of course I came. Behind them, engines roared as the patrol boats pursued Julian downriver. Dr. Pike lay face down on the pier with officers securing his hands. Nate helped the paramedics lift Ruth onto a stretcher. Annie walked beside her, keeping one hand around her mother's fingers. As the ambulance doors opened, Ruth looked past Annie toward Nate. You stopped the wedding? Nate nodded. Ruth managed a tired smile. Good. I never liked that woman. Annie laughed once through the tears she had refused to shed all day. The paramedics moved Ruth inside. Nate stood beside the ambulance as Daniel approached with an update. Julian abandoned the boat near the southern marsh. They found it empty. Where did he go? They do not know. Nate looked toward the river, where the patrol lights disappeared around a bend. Annie climbed into the ambulance beside her mother. Before the doors closed, she looked back at him. Julian had lost the boat, the doctor, and his hostage. But he still had one thing left: the freedom to decide whom he would hurt next. By the time the ambulance reached Charleston Medical Center, Ruth's blood pressure had fallen low enough for the emergency physician to order immediate monitoring. Annie stayed beside her until a nurse asked her to step into the hallway. "You can see her again when we stabilize her," the nurse said. "She is exhausted, but she is conscious." "That matters." Annie nodded, though the words did little to loosen the fear in her chest. Her uniform was stained with river water and dirt from the dock. A thin cut crossed the back of her hand where a wooden splinter had caught her. Daniel arrived 20 minutes later carrying 2 cups of coffee and a paper bag from the hospital cafeteria. "You should eat." "I'm not hungry." "That is not the same as not needing food." He set the bag beside her. Inside was a turkey sandwich, an apple, and a packet of crackers. Annie looked past him. "Where is Mr. Whitmore?" "With the police. Victoria is in custody. Dr. Pike is being questioned, and the Coast Guard is still searching for Julian." "Do they think he made it out of the marsh?" "They found footprints near an access road. Someone may have picked him up." Annie looked toward the treatment room doors. "He will come back. For the evidence? For revenge." Daniel did not dismiss the possibility. "Security will remain at the hospital. No one enters your mother's room without identification, and the hospital has restored you as her emergency contact." Calvin changed it that easily? He had access to the employee benefit system. He knew my mother's illness made her useful. Daniel sat in the chair across from her. Calvin knew many things because Mr. Whitmore trusted him with systems no single person should control. Annie opened the paper bag but did not touch the food. "People keep saying trust like it is an excuse. It is not. Then why does everyone sound surprised?" Calvin had access. Julian had money. Victoria had a reason to rush the wedding. "They did not become dangerous today." "No," Daniel said. "Today was only when someone finally made people look." Across town, Nate stood inside an interview room at the Charleston Police Department, while Victoria Langford sat on the opposite side of a table. Her wedding veil was gone. Someone had given her a gray blanket to place over the stained dress. Her mascara had left dark marks beneath her eyes. But her voice had regained its control. "I want my attorney. He is on his way," the detective said. Victoria looked at Nate. "You should not be here. I requested 5 minutes. You had no right to have me arrested. You kidnapped a sick woman." "Julian did. You went with him." "I was afraid of him." Nate studied her. "You were not afraid when you threatened Annie." Victoria's mouth tightened. The detective remained by the door, recording every word. Victoria lowered her voice. "Nate, I made mistakes, but the child is innocent." "I know. You cannot let the police turn this into something it was not." "What was it?" "A desperate attempt to protect my baby's future. By giving me false DNA results?" She looked away. "By arranging to have me declared mentally unfit?" "That was Calvin's idea." "By paying him through Julian's company?" "I did not manage the transfers." Nate leaned back. Each answer separated her from one piece of the conspiracy while admitting another. She was not trying to prove innocence. She was deciding how much guilt she could survive. "Is Julian the father?" Victoria said nothing. Nate waited. Her hand moved toward her stomach, the same gesture that had once softened him. This time he saw it for what it had become, a shield. "Is my brother the father of that child?" Victoria's eyes filled. "You were never supposed to know." The detective stepped forward. "Mrs. Langford, you have requested an attorney. You should stop speaking." But Nate had already heard enough. He rose. Victoria's voice followed him. "I did love you in my own way." Nate stopped at the door but did not turn around. "No. You loved the life you could reach through me." In another interview room, Dr. Warren Pike was making a faster calculation. He had no family name to protect, no fortune to bargain with, and no confidence that Julian would remain free long enough to help him. His attorney had not yet arrived when he began asking what cooperation might be worth. Daniel joined Nate behind the observation glass. "Pike says Victoria came to him 4 months ago," Daniel explained. "She asked for a non-invasive prenatal paternity test using your sample." "That part I knew." She also brought Julian's sample under another name. Pike tested both, and Julian matched. Yes. Nate watched the doctor rub his hands together on the table. Why keep the second sample? Insurance. Pike suspected they might refuse the final payment. Everyone involved kept evidence against everyone else. That is what happens when criminals call fear loyalty. The detective entered Pike's room. Start from the beginning. Pike looked toward the camera. Victoria Langford was approximately 11 weeks pregnant when she contacted me. She said the possible fathers were two brothers, and that discretion was essential. Nate's face did not move. Pike continued. She provided Nathaniel Whitmore's sample through Calvin Ross. Julian Whitmore came to my clinic after hours. The laboratory excluded Nathaniel and identified Julian as the likely biological father. Did you alter the report? The detective asked. No. I sent the authentic report to Calvin. He created the replacement page. What did you receive? $150,000. Half from Langford Strategic Consulting, half from a company controlled by Julian. Why did you keep a biological sample? Because they frightened me. The detective's expression remained flat. They frightened you after you accepted their money? Pike lowered his head. Yes. Where is the sample now? In a secured medical freezer at my clinic. There is also a signed chain of custody record. Daniel looked at Nate. That will allow an independent test. Nate's attention remained on Pike. Will it be admissible? With a warrant and proper verification, likely. The court will order a new sample from Julian when he is found. When, Nate repeated. Not if. A uniformed officer entered the observation room and handed Daniel a printed message. They found the vehicle that collected Julian near the marsh. Who owns it? Nate asked. A shell company linked to one of his former business partners. The driver abandoned it near a private airfield. Daniel read the rest of the page. A chartered plane left 23 minutes ago. Nate's jaw tightened. Destination? The flight plan says Savannah. And the real destination? Unknown. The pilot switched off the transponder after takeoff. Nate looked through the glass at Pike, then toward the hallway where Victoria waited for her attorney. His brother was still free, but the lie that had protected him was collapsing piece by piece. At the hospital, a nurse finally opened the treatment room door. Miss Carter, your mother is asking for you. Annie entered and found Ruth awake beneath a warmed blanket. The monitors beside her bed had settled into a steady rhythm. Ruth looked at her torn uniform and frowned. You ruined my good work dress. Annie laughed despite herself. I'll replace it. With what money? Mum. Ruth reached for her hand. Did you tell the truth? Yes. Did they listen? Eventually. Ruth squeezed her fingers. People with power often call truth disrespectful when it comes from someone they have decided not to respect. Annie sat beside her. What happens now? Ruth closed her eyes. Now they prove it. At the police station, Daniel's phone rang. He listened for less than a minute, then turned to Nate. The independent laboratory has confirmed the retained sample. Nate waited. Daniel spoke carefully. Julian Whitmore is the biological father. For most of his life, Nate had believed blood was the one bond that survived money, distance, and disappointment. That night, he learned blood could explain a betrayal without excusing it. The next morning, the conference room on the 23rd floor of Whitmore Holdings looked less like the center of a billion-dollar company and more like an evidence room. Daniel Hayes had covered the long walnut table with copies of bank records, medical forms, trust documents, insurance policies, and email printouts. Each group was marked with a colored tab, red for the false DNA report, blue for the payments to Calvin, yellow for the medical documents prepared to declare Nate mentally unfit, green for the inheritance structure built around Victoria's unborn child. Nate stood at the window with Charleston Harbor below him. Tugboats moved between container ships as though nothing had changed. The company still opened its offices at 8. Trucks still left the depots. Employees still answered phones and submitted reports. Only the man whose name stood on the building knew how close he had come to losing control of it. Daniel placed a folder at the head of the table. This is the full structure as we understand it. Nate turned from the window. Annie sat near the far end beside her mother. Ruth had been discharged that morning under strict instructions to rest, but she had refused to remain at the hospital, while Annie gave another statement. Mrs. Bell had brought Ruth a navy cardigan and a thermos of weak tea. Ruth looked tired, but her back remained straight. Nate took his seat. Daniel opened the first folder. Phase 1 was the pregnancy. Victoria knew the child belonged to Julian. Dr. Pike confirmed it before she ever told you the baby was yours. Nate's face remained still. Calvin obtained your sample and controlled the delivery of the result. The laboratory excluded you. He replaced the conclusion page and gave you the altered report. Annie looked toward Calvin's empty chair. He was still in police custody. Daniel continued. Phase 2 was the wedding. The marriage itself would not have given Victoria control of Whitmore Holdings. They needed additional documents. He pushed forward the amended trust agreement. This document recognizes the unborn child as your direct heir. It gives Victoria temporary authority over the child's interest and names Julian manager of the child's trust. Ruth frowned. So the baby was meant to hold the fortune for them. In simple terms, yes, Daniel said. Annie looked at the page. But Mr. Whitmore would still be alive. How could they take the company from him? Daniel opened the yellow folder. That was Phase 3. Inside were copies of Nate's medical records. Several notes described confusion, memory loss, dizziness, and poor judgment. Some referred to incidents Nate did not remember. Others had not yet been signed. Daniel pointed to a draft statement from a physician. Once Nate signed the power of attorney after the ceremony, Victoria would have had a path to act for him if 2 doctors declared him incapable of managing his affairs. Nate read the page without touching it. They planned to make the symptoms real. Yes. Daniel placed a photograph of the sealed coffee cup beside the records. The preliminary screen found traces of a sedative not listed among your prescriptions. We are waiting for the full toxicology report. Ruth looked at Nate. How long had they been giving it to you? We don't know, Daniel said. The dose in the cup was low, enough to cause fatigue and confusion, not enough to draw immediate attention. Nate remembered missing a name during a board meeting 2 weeks earlier. Victoria had laughed and blamed wedding stress. Calvin had suggested he reduce his schedule. Julian had told him 50 was not old, but it was old enough to start letting others carry the weight. The trap had not been built in one day. It had been assembled through small moments he had accepted without question. Annie studied the records. Why would they need both the medical power and the child's trust? To prevent one failure from destroying the entire plan, Daniel said. If the court refused to declare Nate incapacitated, the child would still have inheritance rights. If the paternity claim failed later, Victoria would already have access through the power of attorney and voting agreement. They planned for every possibility, Ruth said. Almost every possibility, Annie replied. The room turned toward her. She looked down at the torn envelope on the table. They did not plan for someone to empty the trash. For the first time that morning, Ruth smiled. Daniel opened the blue folder. The money trail explains the roles. Julian paid Calvin $100,000 before the false report was delivered. Another $250,000 was moved into an offshore account. Victoria's family company paid Dr. Pike. Additional payments were scheduled for after the wedding. Nate looked toward Annie. You said you wanted to study financial investigation. Yes, sir. Daniel moved several documents closer to her. Then look at these. Annie hesitated before standing. She examined the statements. The amounts were divided among consulting fees, debt payments, and transfers between companies with ordinary names. Langford Advisory, Palmetto Holdings, Harbor Management Services. They tried to make each payment look unrelated, she said. Daniel nodded. What connects them? The dates. Go on. The payment to Calvin happened 4 days before the report was delivered. The payment to Dr. Pike came the day after the samples were collected. The trust company received money the same week the wedding was moved forward. Daniel pointed to another column. And here? Annie followed the account numbers. The same routing bank. Exactly. She sat again. Daniel closed the folder. Financial investigation is not just finding a large payment. It is noticing when small, respectable transactions begin telling the same story. Nate looked at the table covered with the architecture of his betrayal. Calvin approved every document that reached me. Yes, I gave him authority over my medical records, legal schedule, travel, and private correspondence. Yes, I let one man control every door. Daniel did not soften the answer. You did. Ruth shifted in her chair. Trusting someone is not a crime. No, Nate said. But building a system where no one can question the person you trust is negligence. The words settled over the room. He did not blame Victoria alone. He did not blame Julian alone. He did not blame Calvin for every failure inside Whitmore Holdings. He had built the structure they used. Nate turned to Daniel. How many employees could report concerns about Calvin without going through Calvin? Daniel already knew the answer. None directly. And medical assistants? His office approved special requests. Annie glanced at Ruth. Nate saw it. My company helped your mother, he said, but the same system allowed him to change her emergency contact and remove her from a hospital. Ruth folded her hands over her lap. A good policy means little if one bad man can decide who deserves it. Nate nodded. The conference room door opened. Margaret Whitmore entered with Porter behind her. She wore the same pearl brooch from the wedding, though her clothes were now plain and dark. She looked first at Nate, then at Ruth and Annie. I was told Julian is still missing. He is, Nate said. He called me. The room became quiet. When? Daniel asked. 20 minutes ago. From what number? I don't know. It was blocked. What did he want? Margaret's eyes moved toward the trust documents. He said the company belonged to the family before it belonged to the board, the courts, or that girl. Annie did not react. Margaret continued. He asked me to access an account our father established years ago. He said he needed enough money to leave the country. Nate stood. What did you tell him? Margaret's mouth tightened. I told him I would help. Ruth closed her eyes. Daniel rose from his chair. Mrs. Whitmore, did you transfer anything? No. Then why did you say yes? Margaret removed a small digital recorder from her purse and placed it on the table. Because for 43 years, I kept saving my son from the consequences of being my son. Her voice broke, but she did not look away. I will not do it again. Nate stared at the recorder. Margaret touched the pearl brooch at her collar. He is calling back at noon. Daniel checked the time. 11:52. Nate looked around the table at the lawyer, the sick housekeeper, the young maid, and the mother who had finally chosen truth over blood. The people closest to power had protected the lie. Now the people it had wounded were preparing to end it. At 11:58, Daniel moved everyone except Nate and Margaret out of the conference room. The police had already placed a trace on Margaret's phone, though the detective warned them not to expect a quick location. Julian had used blocked numbers, disposable phones, and internet calls since leaving the marsh. He understood enough about Whitmore systems to know which channels were monitored. Margaret sat at the end of the table with the digital recorder beside her purse. Her pearl brooch rose and fell with each breath. Nate remained across from her. You do not have to take the call, he said. Yes, I do. He may threaten you. He has been threatening everyone else because I spent his entire life teaching him that I would protect him. Nate looked at the clock on the wall. Do not promise him money you cannot access. I can access it. Daniel, standing near the door, turned back. What account? My late husband created a private family reserve after Julian was born. It was meant for emergencies. How much is in it? Just over $4 million. Nate stared at her. You never told me. It was not yours. It was company money? No, personal funds placed in trust before your father died. Daniel returned to the table. Who are the trustees? I am the primary trustee. Julian becomes the beneficiary when I die. And you can authorize a withdrawal? Yes. Daniel exchanged a look with Nate. That may be why he called you rather than another associate. The clock reached noon. Margaret's phone rang. She waited through the second ring before answering. Julian, are you alone? His voice sounded distant, with road noise behind it. Yes. Where is Nate? I don't know. He stopped speaking to me after the police came. Nate watched his mother's face. She had spent decades protecting Julian with half-truths. Now she used the same skill against him. Did you access the reserve? Julian asked. I can. That was not my question. I need your destination before I authorize anything. No. Then I cannot help you. You said you would. I said I would try. The bank will ask questions if I move $4 million without documentation. Julian went silent. Margaret continued. Tell me how much you need. All of it. Her fingers tightened around the phone. What have you done that requires $4 million? You know what Nate is doing. He will make sure I spend the rest of my life in prison. You kidnapped a sick woman. That was not the plan. But you did it. She was leverage. Margaret closed her eyes. Nate could see the answer injure her even though she had already heard the facts. Julian, she said, Ruth Carter has worked for this family for 12 years. And now her daughter is destroying it. No, her daughter told the truth. The line went quiet. Daniel wrote on a legal pad and slid it toward Margaret. Keep him calm. Margaret read it. I am still trying to help you, she said, but I need to understand where you are going. I'm not telling you. Then tell me where to send the money. A holding account. What bank? I will text the details. That will take hours to clear. If you need to leave the country, cash would be faster. Nate frowned, but Daniel nodded for her to continue. Julian lowered his voice. Can you get cash? Not 4 million by noon. How much? Perhaps 500,000. When? By late afternoon. Another stretch of silence followed. A horn sounded faintly through Julian's phone. Not a car horn. A train. Daniel wrote 2 words. Keep talking. Margaret said, You sound tired. I have not slept. Are you hurt? No. Are you alone? Julian did not answer. Her voice softened, and for a moment she sounded like the mother who had waited beside his bed through childhood fevers. Where is Victoria? She is where she belongs. In custody? Yes. And Calvin? He betrayed us. He has been helping the police. Julian cursed under his breath. Margaret looked at Daniel. He wrote another question. Ask about evidence. Julian, the police found records in Calvin's possession. Is there anything else they could use against you? Why? Because I need to know whether money will be enough. Julian gave a bitter laugh. Money is always enough. Not if they can prove the child is yours. They cannot. They have Dr. Pike. Pike has no usable sample. Margaret looked up sharply. Nate heard the certainty in Julian's voice. What do you mean? She asked. The retained sample was switched. Daniel wrote faster. When? Margaret asked. When did you switch it? I did not say I did. You just said it was switched. Julian's breathing changed. He had realized the mistake. This call is over. Wait, I can still get the cash. 500,000? Yes. Bring it to the old freight terminal on Spruill Avenue at 4. Daniel immediately sent the location to the detectives outside. Margaret said, That area is watched. Then come alone and make sure you are not followed. I cannot carry that much cash by myself. Use a suitcase. Julian, if I see police, I leave. If I see Nate, I leave. If anyone follows you, I send every document I have to the press. What documents? The ones proving Nate knew about the false report. Nate's expression hardened. Margaret glanced at him. You said he did not know. I said I could make it look as if he knew. The call ended. For several seconds, no one moved. Then Daniel opened the conference room door. Detectives and federal agents entered immediately. The freight terminal gives us a location, the lead detective said, but he will be watching every road. Margaret placed the phone on the table. He also said the retained sample was switched. Daniel nodded. That may be a bluff, but we need the laboratory to secure it again. Nate looked at him. The independent test already confirmed Julian. Using the sample Pike retained, a court-ordered sample directly from Julian will still be required. And until he is arrested, his attorney can attack the chain of custody. The detective asked Margaret to repeat the exact words Julian had used. She did, without adding or omitting anything. Annie and Ruth returned to the room after the officers finished reviewing the call. Ruth moved slowly, leaning on a cane the hospital had given her. Annie carried the thermos and stayed close enough to catch her if needed. Margaret rose when she saw them. For once, she did not wait for Ruth to greet her first. Mrs. Carter, she said. What my son did to you was inexcusable. Ruth studied her. Yes, ma'am, it was. Margaret seemed unprepared for the plainness of the response. I am sorry. I believe you are. But you do not forgive me. Ruth lowered herself into a chair. Forgiveness is not a door wealthy people can open by saying the correct sentence. Margaret looked down. Ruth continued. You protected your son because you loved him. Mr. Whitmore protected him for the same reason. But love without consequences becomes permission. Nate absorbed the words without defending himself. The lead detective outlined the plan. Margaret would go to the freight terminal with a suitcase containing only enough real money to appear convincing. Officers would position themselves inside abandoned warehouses and along the rail line. Nate would remain at the command post. Annie and Ruth would return to the hospital under protection. Annie shook her head. Julian may know she spoke to us. He likely assumes she did, the detective said. That is why he will test whether she is followed. What if he does not come himself? Then we identify whoever he sends. Daniel turned toward Nate. There is another problem. He held up Calvin's phone. A new message had appeared from the same blocked contact Julian had used before. The message contained a photograph. Annie recognized the location first. It was the hallway outside Ruth's hospital room. The photograph had been taken less than an hour earlier. Beneath it was one sentence: "The girl comes with the money, or her mother does not survive the night." Ruth's face lost its color. Nate looked at Annie. "No." Annie took the phone from Daniel and read the message again. "He is not asking because he needs me," she said. "He is asking because he wants to punish me. That is exactly why you are not going," Nate replied. Annie lifted her eyes. "He already reached the hospital once. Staying away did not keep my mother safe. This is not your decision alone. It became my decision when he put my name in the message." Nate stepped closer. "You are 18 years old, and everyone keeps saying that as though fear belongs more naturally to young people than courage does." No one answered. Outside the windows, a freight train moved along the edge of Charleston, its horn carrying across the harbor. At 4 o'clock, Julian expected a frightened mother, a suitcase of money, and the girl who had ruined his plan. What he did not know was that Annie had stopped entering rooms unprepared. At 3:45, Margaret Whitmore's sedan rolled into the abandoned freight terminal on Sproul Avenue. The old terminal sat between rusted rail lines and empty warehouses that had once moved cotton, machinery, and shipping parts through Charleston. Tall weeds pushed through cracks in the pavement. A freight train waited several hundred yards away, its engine idling with a low mechanical hum. Margaret sat behind the wheel with both hands at 10 and 2, the way Nate's father had taught her more than 40 years earlier. A black suitcase rested on the passenger seat, $50,000 in real cash-covered bundles of cut paper beneath it. Annie sat in the back. She wore jeans, a dark sweatshirt, and the blue handkerchief tied around her wrist. Beneath her shirt, a small transmitter had been taped near her collarbone. A second device was hidden in the lining of the suitcase. Nate listened from a command van parked inside a warehouse 2 blocks away. Daniel sat beside him with the lead detective, a federal agent, and Porter. Tactical officers waited behind concrete barriers and inside empty rail cars. Ruth remained at the hospital under police protection. Nate had argued until the final minute that Annie should not go. Annie had answered only once: "If Julian believes I'm afraid enough to obey, let him keep believing it." Now Nate watched a live camera feed from a lens mounted inside Margaret's brooch. Margaret stopped the car in the center of the terminal yard. No one appeared. Annie looked through the rear window. "He can see us." "I know," Margaret said. "How?" "He used to come here with his father. There are offices above the loading floor." Margaret's voice stayed composed, but Annie saw the tremor in her fingers when she turned off the engine. The phone on the dashboard rang. Margaret answered on speaker. "We are here." Julian's voice came through. "You brought her?" "Yes. Tell Annie to get out with the suitcase." Margaret looked toward the empty yard. "You said I was bringing the money." "I changed the arrangement." Annie reached between the seats. "Where are you?" "Close enough. My mother is alive. You proved that before. Threatening her again does not give you more control." "You still think this is about control?" "What is it about?" Julian laughed quietly. "You walked into my family's wedding wearing a servant's uniform and decided you had the right to judge us. I found evidence of a crime. You found trash. And it was enough." His breathing sharpened. Margaret turned slightly. "Julian, take the money and leave the girl out of this. You brought her exactly as I asked, because I wanted you to believe I would." Silence followed. Inside the command van, Nate looked at the detective. "Was that part of the plan?" "No," the detective said. Nate reached for the radio, but Daniel stopped him. "Let her continue." Margaret looked through the windshield toward the dark upper windows of the terminal. "I spent your life protecting you," she said. "I lied to your father. I paid your debts. I told Nate to give you positions you had not earned. Every time you failed, I called it a mistake. Every time you hurt someone, I called you misunderstood. Mother, no, you will hear me now." Her voice did not rise. "I thought love meant making sure you never fell. All I did was make sure you never learned how to stand." Annie watched the upper windows. A shape moved behind broken glass. She touched Margaret's shoulder and pointed. Julian stepped into view on the second-floor walkway. He held a handgun in one hand and a phone in the other. "Get out of the car," he ordered. Annie opened the rear door. Nate leaned toward the monitor. "Too early. She has to keep him visible." the detective replied. Annie lifted the suitcase and stepped onto the pavement. The afternoon heat pressed against her sweatshirt. Gravel shifted beneath her shoes. She could see Julian above her, but not well enough to know whether anyone stood behind him. "Put the suitcase in the center of the yard," he said. She carried it 20 feet and lowered it. "Open it." Annie unzipped the case. Julian stared at the cash. "Step away." "No." His gun lifted. Inside the command van, several officers reached for their radios. Annie kept her hands visible. "You asked for me because you wanted to punish me," she said. "I'm here. Now tell me what you plan to do." "I plan to leave." "With $50,000? Julian's face changed. He had expected $4 million. Margaret stepped out of the car. "This is what I could withdraw without freezing the trust. You lied to me. You lied to all of us." Julian aimed the gun toward her. "Get back in the car." Margaret did not move. "You will not shoot me," she said. "You do not know what I will do. I know exactly what you will do. You will blame Nate, Victoria, Calvin, Annie, your father, and me. You will name every person in your life before you name yourself." Julian came down the metal stairs. Each step rang through the terminal. Annie stayed near the suitcase. She could hear Daniel's instructions through the small earpiece hidden beneath her hair. "Keep him talking. Do not move toward him." Julian reached the ground. His suit was wrinkled and stained from the marsh. A cut crossed one cheek. He looked older than he had at the wedding, though less than 2 days had passed. "Where are the real records?" he asked Annie. "With the police." "Where are your copies?" "Safe. You told me there were pieces Daniel had not seen." "I lied." His mouth tightened. "You think that makes you clever?" "No. It means I learned from the people around you." He stepped closer and pressed the gun against her side. Margaret drew a breath. In the command van, Nate stood. The detective grabbed his arm. "Not yet." Julian took Annie by the shoulder and pulled her toward the warehouse entrance. "The suitcase stays," Annie said. "You are coming with me." "That was not the deal." "There was never a deal." Annie allowed herself to stumble as he pushed her forward. Her hand brushed the phone in his coat pocket. She had seen its screen light up when he approached. The recording application was open. Julian was recording the exchange, likely intending to edit it later. Annie looked at him. "You said you could make it appear Mr. Whitmore knew about the false report." Julian froze for half a second. Margaret understood what Annie was doing. "Tell her how," she said. Julian pulled Annie closer. "Be quiet." "You threatened to send documents to the press," Margaret continued. "Documents proving Nate knew." "But he did not know, did he?" Julian's eyes moved between them. "No," he said. "He did not." Annie felt the gun against her ribs. "Then say who did." "You already know. The police need to hear it from you." His expression twisted. "You still think the police are coming to save you?" Annie looked toward the broken windows. "No, I think they are already here." Julian turned. That was the moment the officers moved. Commands erupted from both sides of the yard. "Drop the weapon." Julian dragged Annie backward and placed the gun beneath her jaw. Nate heard her gasp through the transmitter. Every officer stopped. Julian's face pressed near hers. "You ruined everything." Annie's voice shook, but she answered, "No. I only made everyone look at what you had already done." He pulled her toward the warehouse. Then Margaret stepped between him and the open doorway. "If you want someone to blame," she said, "blame the woman who taught you consequences were for other people." Julian aimed the weapon at his mother. Annie drove her heel down onto his foot and dropped her weight. The gun shifted. A tactical officer fired once. Julian fell against the warehouse wall. The weapon struck the pavement and slid beneath an abandoned loading cart. Annie hit the ground and covered her head. Officers reached them within seconds. One pulled Annie away. Two restrained Julian, who had been struck in the shoulder and remained conscious. Nate ran across the yard before anyone could stop him. He dropped beside Annie. "Are you hurt?" She looked at her hands, then at the place where the gun had pressed against her skin. "No." Only after answering did she begin to shake. Nate removed his jacket and placed it around her shoulders. Across the yard, Margaret stood over her wounded son as paramedics cut away his sleeve. Julian looked up at her. "Mother." Margaret's face broke, but she did not move toward him. For the first time in his life, she let other people carry him away to face what he had done. By midnight, Julian Whitmore was under armed guard in a private hospital room with a bullet wound through his shoulder. and a federal agent seated outside the door. The injury was not life-threatening. The surgeon had removed the bullet, repaired the damaged muscle, and told investigators Julian would be well enough to answer questions by morning. For the first time in his life, pain had arrived without a family member waiting nearby to make it disappear. Margaret sat alone in the hospital chapel 2 floors below. She had refused coffee, water, and the offer of a driver. Her pearl brooch lay in her open palm. The pin had bent when Annie fell against her during the arrest, but Margaret continued turning it between her fingers as though it might explain where love had ended and permission had begun. Nate found her there shortly after 1 in the morning. He did not sit beside her immediately. "How is Annie?" Margaret asked. "She has bruising along her ribs and a cut beneath her jaw. No serious injuries." "And Ruth?" "Stable. The doctors want to keep her overnight." Margaret nodded. "Julian? He will live." Her shoulders lowered, though she did not smile. Nate sat at the other end of the pew. Between them was the space where Julian should have learned to stand on his own. "I saw the gun move toward you," Nate said. "So did I." "You still stepped forward." "I am his mother." "That has always been your answer." Margaret closed her fingers around the brooch. "What answer would satisfy you?" "The truth." She looked toward the wooden cross above the altar. "The truth is that I knew what he was becoming long before this week. Not the details, not Victoria or the test, but I knew the kind of man he was becoming." Nate said nothing. He borrowed money and called it a temporary problem. He lied and called it embarrassment. He hurt people and called himself misunderstood. "Every time you tried to force him to face something, I asked you to be patient. You asked me to protect the family. I meant protect Julian." The admission came without defense. Margaret looked at him. "You were 28 when your father died. You inherited a company, its debts, its employees, and a younger brother who blamed you for being chosen. I told you keeping him close would prevent resentment. It gave him access." "Yes." Nate looked down at his hands. "I thought giving him titles would make him responsible, and I thought removing consequences would make him grateful. Neither of them had been right." At the other end of the hospital, Annie sat beside Ruth's bed wearing a clean sweatshirt provided by a nurse. Nate's jacket was folded over the back of a chair. The smell of dust and river water still clung to it. Ruth watched her daughter tear the corner from a packet of crackers without eating any. "You keep opening food and forgetting why," she said. "I'm not hungry. You said that 3 hours ago. I still mean it." Ruth reached for Annie's wrist and touched the blue handkerchief tied there. "You went into that freight yard knowing he had a gun. The police were there. He put the gun under your chin." Annie looked away. Ruth's voice softened. "Being brave does not mean pretending it did not scare you. I thought he was going to shoot Mrs. Whitmore. And before that, I thought he was going to take me into the warehouse. And before that," Annie's throat tightened, "I thought I might never see you again." Ruth squeezed her hand. Annie finally looked at her mother. "Was I wrong to go?" "That is not the right question." "What is? What will you learn from surviving it?" Annie let out a tired breath. "That rich people create complicated problems." Ruth smiled. That was not new information. A knock came at the door. Daniel entered with a folder under one arm. He paused when he saw Nate's jacket. "Mr. Whitmore asked me to tell you Julian has been charged." "With what?" Annie asked. "Kidnapping, witness intimidation, assault with a deadly weapon, conspiracy to commit fraud, and several federal offenses connected to the financial plan. More charges will follow." "And Victoria?" "She has been formally charged as a co-conspirator." Her attorney advised her to remain silent. Ruth raised an eyebrow. "Did she?" "For almost 40 minutes. Annie understood. Then she started blaming Julian. Daniel opened the folder. "She claims he controlled the entire plan. Calvin says Victoria designed the inheritance structure. Pike says all 3 of them attended at least one meeting." "Will they turn on one another?" Ruth asked. "They already have." Daniel placed a printed transcript on the bedside table. The recording from Julian's phone had captured more than his threats at the freight terminal. It had also recorded his answer when Margaret asked whether Nate knew about the false report. No, he did not. It had captured him acknowledging the altered evidence, the plan to frame Nate, and his demand for money. "The recording is clear," Daniel said. "It will be difficult for his attorney to explain." Annie read the first page. "What about the DNA sample?" "A judge authorized a direct collection from Julian at the hospital." It will be tested by 2 independent laboratories. And if it confirms he is the father, it establishes the truth about the child. The fraud case does not depend on paternity alone, but it will close one of the arguments they hope to use. Ruth looked at Daniel. What happens to the baby? The court will appoint an independent guardian to protect the child's interests. Mr. Whitmore has instructed us not to challenge any support intended for the child's health or care. Annie lowered the transcript. After everything they did, the child did none of it, Daniel said. A few minutes later, Nate entered. He greeted Ruth first. Mrs. Carter. Mr. Whitmore. He stood beside the bed without trying to make the room belong to him. The doctors say you will recover. They also say I have to stop being kidnapped after dialysis. Nate almost smiled. I have asked security to make that a permanent policy. Ruth studied him. Security is not the same as trust. No, and money is not the same as making something right. I know. Annie watched him carefully. The man standing in the hospital room no longer looked like the groom from the glass chapel. His tuxedo shirt was open at the collar, his sleeve torn, and fatigue had settled across his face. He turned to her. You saved my life. Annie shook her head. I stopped you from signing papers. The medical plan suggests those papers were not the last step. You believed me before you had proof. I believed there was enough reason to stop. That is different. Yes, Nate said. It is. He looked toward Ruth. I cannot undo what happened, but no one connected to my company will interfere with your care again. Daniel is removing Calvin's authority from every employee system tonight. Ruth did not thank him immediately. That should be done for every worker, she said, not just because my daughter embarrassed powerful people in a church. It will be. Nate turned back to Annie. You also need protection until the trial. I need to finish my college applications. Daniel glanced at her. Both can happen. Nate gave a slow nod. Then both will. Outside the room, footsteps approached. A detective appeared at the doorway. Mr. Whitmore, Julian is awake. He has asked to speak with you before his attorney arrives. Nate's expression hardened. Daniel said, You are under no obligation to go. Nate looked at Annie, then at Ruth. People with power often mistake access for forgiveness, Ruth said. Do not make the same mistake he did. Nate left the room and followed the detective upstairs. Julian lay propped against white pillows, his shoulder bandaged and his wrist cuffed to the bed rail. When Nate entered, Julian tried to smile. You came. Nate remained near the door. You asked for me. Julian looked toward the cuff. Tell them to take this off. No, I'm your brother. Nate's face did not change. That explains why this hurts. It does not change what you did. Julian's smile disappeared. For the first time, there was no mother beside him, no assistant to alter a record, no brother preparing to pay the cost. There was only a locked room, a waiting attorney, and the truth he had spent years believing belonged to weaker people. Nate remained near the hospital room door, while Julian watched him from the bed. You always did enjoy being the righteous one, Julian said. I'm not here to argue about childhood. No, you're here to look at me like a criminal before a judge has done it for you. You kidnapped Ruth Carter, held a gun to Annie's throat, and tried to steal control of my company. Julian shifted against the pillows and winced as the movement pulled at his bandaged shoulder. You think this started with your company? It started with choices. It started when our father decided you were the future and I was the problem. Nate said nothing. Julian looked toward the dark hospital window. You got his office before he was buried. You got the board. You got the house. Every time people said Whitmore, they meant you. You received shares, property, and a position in the company. I received whatever kept me quiet. You received chances. From you. Yes. Julian gave a short laugh. That was the worst part. You never let me forget who was saving me. Nate stepped farther into the room, though he kept his distance from the bed. I paid your debts because Mother begged me. I covered your mistakes because I thought protecting the family meant protecting you. I gave you positions you had not earned and called it another chance. I thought saving you from consequences was love. Julian looked back at him. I was wrong, Nate said. I only taught you that someone else would always pay. For a moment, Julian had no answer. Then his expression hardened. Victoria came to me before she came to you. I know. She loved me. She used you. We used each other. That is not love. You would know? The question reached the place Julian intended. But Nate did not react. Julian continued. You spent 10 years mourning a dead woman, and then acted grateful when Victoria offered you a child. You did not love her. You loved what she promised. Nate considered denying it. Instead, he nodded. Partly, the honesty unsettled Julian more than anger would have. Nate looked toward the cuff around his brother's wrist. I wanted a family badly enough to ignore how quickly everything moved. That was my weakness. It did not force you to make the child part of a fraud. The child is a Whitmore. The child is not an account number. It would have inherited eventually. Not through deception. Julian leaned forward. You have more than you could spend in 10 lifetimes. And that made you entitled to take it? It made your obsession with keeping all of it obscene. Nate's face remained calm. You were not trying to redistribute wealth. You were trying to control it. Julian looked away. The attorney assigned to wait outside knocked once, warning that private conversation would end soon. Julian lowered his voice. Help me. Nate studied him. Tell the prosecutor I cooperated. Tell them the gun went off by accident. Tell them Annie agreed to come. You know how these things work. Yes, Nate said. I do. Hope entered Julian's face. That is why I will not interfere. You would let your own brother go to prison? I will let a court decide what happens to a man who kidnapped a sick woman and threatened an 18-year-old girl. Julian's mouth tightened. Blood means nothing to you. Blood explains why I came into this room. It does not require me to lie when I leave it. Nate turned toward the door. Not. He stopped. Julian's voice had lost its anger. Do you hate me? Nate looked back at the brother he had defended for most of his life. No. Hate would make this easier. He left before Julian could answer. 3 weeks later, the federal courthouse in Charleston filled before 9 in the morning. Victoria entered through a side door wearing a navy suit and no jewelry. Julian appeared with his arm in a sling. Calvin walked between 2 federal marshals. Dr. Pike had already entered a cooperation agreement and was expected to testify. The charges were read in separate hearings. Fraud, bribery, falsification of medical documents, conspiracy to seize corporate assets, witness intimidation, kidnapping, assault with a deadly weapon, obstruction of justice. Victoria's attorney argued that pregnancy, fear, and manipulation by Julian had affected her judgment. Julian's attorney blamed Victoria and Calvin. Calvin's attorney described his client as a pressured employee who had made one terrible decision after decades of service. Daniel listened from the second row. Interesting, Annie whispered beside him. They planned everything together, but now, no one remembers being in charge. That is common when a conspiracy stops being profitable. Ruth sat on Annie's other side with a cane resting against her knee. She had insisted on attending only the first hearing. When Calvin was led past them, he looked at Annie. You ruined my life, he said. A marshal told him to keep moving. Annie did not raise her voice. No, Mr. Ross. I found the paper. You wrote the rest yourself. He looked away. The direct DNA test ordered after Julian's arrest confirmed he was the biological father. The court appointed an independent guardian to represent the unborn child's interests. Nate instructed Daniel not to challenge medical support or lawful care for the baby. The child did none of this, Nate said when the board questioned the expense. We will not punish someone for the adults who used their birth as leverage. The reforms at Whitmore Holdings began before the first trial date was set. Calvin's role was divided among 4 departments. No assistant could control medical records, legal documents, financial access, and executive communications at the same time. All major trust amendments required 2 independent legal reviews. Employee medical files could no longer be changed without confirmation from the employee or an authorized family member. Nate established an outside reporting system that bypassed supervisors and executive staff. Complaints could be reviewed by an independent ethics firm. Employees dismissed or reassigned at Victoria's request were contacted and offered reinstatement, back pay, or settlement. Some accepted, others did not. Nate did not demand gratitude from either group. At the first employee meeting after the arrests, he stood before cooks, housekeepers, drivers, accountants, port workers, and hotel managers. I believed good intentions were enough to make a fair system, he told them. They are not. A policy means nothing when one powerful person can decide who is protected by it. Mrs. Bell stood near the back with her arms folded. Nate continued. Some of you raised concerns and were ignored. Some stayed silent because speaking carried too much risk. That failure belongs to the company. and the company begins with me. There was no applause. Nate had not asked for any. Afterward, Margaret found Annie near the hospital entrance, where Ruth was waiting for a follow-up appointment. Margaret wore a plain gray coat. The pearl brooch was gone. "I owe you an apology," she said. Annie waited. "I used your mother's treatment to shame you into silence. I spoke as though assistance gave our family ownership over your gratitude." "Yes, ma'am." Margaret seemed surprised by the lack of comfort in Annie's answer. "I was wrong." "Yes, ma'am. Can you forgive me?" Annie looked toward Ruth, who was watching from a bench several yards away. "I may, but forgiveness is not something I owe on the day you ask for it." Margaret lowered her head. "Your mother said something similar. She usually says it better." A faint smile passed between them. But it did not erase what had happened. Nate arrived carrying a small bouquet and a folder containing Ruth's restored medical benefits. There were no cameras and no company representatives with him. He handed the flowers to Ruth. "I was told lilies are not appropriate for a renal ward." "Who told you that?" "Mrs. Bell. She saved you from making a funeral arrangement. So I understand." Ruth accepted the flowers. Nate gave her the folder. "Your treatment will continue under the employee plan. Your job will remain available, with lighter duties if you decide to return." Ruth opened the folder but did not thank him yet. "And the other workers?" "The same review applies to everyone affected." She nodded. "Then I appreciate it." Nate turned toward Annie. "I would like to speak with you when your mother's appointment is finished." "About what?" "Your future." Annie glanced at Ruth. Her mother smiled. "Go hear the man out." Listening does not mean agreeing. An hour later, Nate and Annie sat across from each other in the hospital cafeteria. He had black coffee. She had hot chocolate. Nate folded his hands on the table. "Why did you stand against people who could have destroyed your life?" Annie looked at the blue handkerchief tied around her wrist. "Because my mother taught me that silence in front of a lie only helps it become the truth." Nate nodded slowly. Outside the cafeteria window, hospital employees crossed the parking lot at the end of their shifts. None of them knew that a wedding had been stopped, a company had nearly been stolen, and 3 powerful people were awaiting trial because one young woman had refused to look away. Nate reached for the folder beside his coffee. "Then let's discuss what you plan to do with that courage next." Nate opened the folder and slid it across the cafeteria table. Inside were brochures from 2 colleges, information about a financial investigation program, and a letter from an independent auditing firm in Charleston. Annie read the first page, then looked up. "What is this?" "En option." "It looks expensive." "It is. I'm not asking you to pay for college because I stopped your wedding." "I know. Then why are you offering?" "Because you told Daniel you wanted to study financial investigation before any of this happened. You noticed what trained people ignored, preserved evidence instead of destroying it, and brought it to someone who could verify it. That is not a reward. It is an investment in work you already chose." Annie looked down at the letter again. The auditing firm was offering a summer internship after her first year, provided she maintained the required grades. "What would I owe Whitmore Holdings?" "Nothing." "You would pay tuition and not expect me to work for your company?" "Yes. People do not usually give money without wanting something back." Nate lifted his coffee. "That belief nearly cost me everything." Annie studied him, searching for the condition hidden beneath the offer. "There are rules," he said. "I knew it. You must remain enrolled. The scholarship covers tuition, books, and reasonable living costs. You choose the school. Your grades go to an independent education trust, not to me. If you decide to leave the program, the remaining funds go to another student. And the internship? Optional. Why an independent trust? So no one can use your education to control you. Not me, not the company, not whoever sits in my office after I'm gone." Annie closed the folder. "I need to talk to my mother." "I expected that." Nate stood, but Annie stopped him. "Mr. Whitmore." He waited. "What happens to your brother?" "The court decides." "And Victoria?" "The same. Calvin. He accepted a cooperation agreement this morning. He will still serve time. Do you feel sorry for them?" Nate considered the question. "I feel grief." "That is not the same as believing they should escape the consequences." Annie nodded. That afternoon, Ruth read every page of the scholarship documents from her hospital chair. She moved slowly, using a pen to mark sections she wanted Daniel to explain. "He really put in writing that you do not owe the company anything," she said. "I read that part. You read quickly when you are excited." "I'm not excited." Ruth looked over the top of the pages. You have had the same expression since you were 10 and found out the library was giving away old mystery books. Annie sat beside the window. What if people think I got it because I became famous for 5 minutes? People will think whatever makes your work easier to dismiss. What do you think? I think someone opened a door. You still have to walk through it, attend class, pass your exams, and get up when you would rather sleep. Annie smiled. You make everything sound difficult. Most worthwhile things are. Ruth signed the section confirming that she had reviewed the terms with her daughter. 1 year later, Annie returned to Whitmore House on a Saturday afternoon carrying a backpack filled with accounting textbooks. She had completed 2 semesters of financial investigation and forensic accounting. She still lived with Ruth in their apartment near the bus line, though the scholarship covered a small room closer to campus during exam weeks. She had learned how shell companies moved money, how altered invoices hid theft, and how honest numbers could be arranged to tell a dishonest story. The first semester had been harder than she admitted to anyone. She had failed her first statistics exam. For 2 days, she considered leaving the program before Ruth placed the test on the kitchen table and asked, "Did the paper tell you that you cannot learn? Or did it tell you what you have not learned yet?" Annie stayed. By spring, she had earned the highest grade in her fraud examination class. Ruth had returned to Whitmore House 3 mornings a week in a lighter supervisory position. She no longer carried linen baskets or spent hours standing. She trained new staff, reviewed schedules, and sat on the employee welfare committee Nate had created after the investigation. Several workers dismissed at Victoria's request had returned. Others accepted settlements and moved on. Mrs. Bell had retired but visited often enough that no one believed she had truly left. Whitmore Holdings no longer allowed one assistant to control Nate's medical records, finances, legal appointments, and private correspondence. Every major document passed through 2 independent reviews. Employee complaints went to an outside firm, and reports could no longer be erased by a supervisor. The reforms had cost money, time, and several members of the old board. Nate considered that a fair price. The trials had ended 6 months earlier. Julian received a long federal sentence after pleading guilty to kidnapping, fraud, and witness intimidation. Victoria was convicted on conspiracy and financial fraud charges. Calvin testified against both of them and received a reduced sentence, though the judge made clear that cooperation did not erase 20 years of access used for betrayal. The court appointed an independent guardian for Victoria and Julian's child, a healthy boy born while Victoria awaited sentencing. Nate paid nothing toward any fraudulent inheritance claim, but he approved a protected medical and education fund that neither parent could control. When Daniel asked why, Nate answered, "A child should not begin life serving a sentence for crimes committed before he was born." Annie found Ruth in the staff dining room drinking sweet tea with 2 housekeepers. After lunch, she crossed the garden alone. The glass chapel stood near the edge of the property, empty except for rows of oak benches and afternoon light. The wedding roses had disappeared long ago. The altar had been cleared. Without guests, music, or flowers, the room looked smaller. Nate stood near the glass wall facing the ocean. He wore no suit jacket, only a white shirt with the sleeves rolled to his forearms. In one hand, he held his father's silver pocket watch. "You still come here?" Annie asked. He turned. "Sometimes." "Why?" "To remember how close I came to promising my life to a lie." Annie walked farther inside. "That sounds painful." "It is useful." The ocean moved beyond the glass. A church bell rang somewhere in Charleston, followed by another. Nate closed the pocket watch. "How is school?" "I passed statistics." "That was not my question. It was the important part." He smiled. "Your internship begins next month, at an independent auditing firm, not yours." I remember the agreement. They assigned me to expense fraud. Disappointed? No. People reveal a lot through receipts. Nate looked toward the aisle where she had stood a year earlier. That day, everyone I trusted was standing close to me. Annie followed his gaze. "But you were the only one who walked toward me with the truth," he said. "Maybe they were afraid of losing what you could give them." "And you were not afraid?" She thought of Victoria's threats, Julian's gun, and her mother's voice over the phone from the boat. "I was terrified." Nate waited. "Courage is not the absence of fear," Annie said. "It is knowing silence would leave a deeper regret." The bells continued outside. Nate had called her Miss Carter for most of the year. It had been respectful, but it had also preserved the distance between the billionaire and the young employee who had interrupted his wedding. This time, he said only, "Annie." She looked at him. "Your mother is waiting." "I know. She sent me to find you because she says you forget lunch when you stand in here." "That sounds like Ruth." She brought peach cobbler. Nate placed the pocket watch in his shirt pocket and followed Annie toward the doors. She left the chapel first, her backpack over one shoulder, heading toward the house before catching the evening bus back to campus. Nate watched her cross the garden without looking behind her. For most of his life, he had believed loyalty was measured by years, titles, shared blood, and how close a person stood when others were watching. Annie Carter had taught him otherwise. The most loyal person was not always the one standing closest to power. Sometimes, it was the person with nothing but the truth and enough courage to speak, while the whole room chose silence. The story reminds us that truth does not become less valuable because it is spoken by someone young, poor, or overlooked. Real loyalty is not measured by blood, wealth, job titles, or years spent standing beside a powerful person. It is revealed when someone chooses honesty despite fear and personal risk. The story also teaches that kindness should never be used to demand silence, and that justice only becomes meaningful when the powerful accept responsibility, instead of protecting those they love from the consequences of their actions. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.